A trend I've noticed and thought about quite a lot during my years watching competitive League of Legends is the way people gauge and evaluate the strength of junglers. And there's a very specific type of jungler, the jungler that strength shines when he's on mechanically intensive jungle champions or ones that allow a lot of opportunities for outplays or creative ganks. That these sorts of players, when the meta suits them, when they're in their prime, when they're getting their picks and they're in a very good team, they are not only elevated as like some of the world's best junglers, which is where they should be, but oftentimes they will then just instantly take like the status of like, this guy's the best jungler. And people will then apply this fallacy to them, which I understand why it exists, because there's an intuitive level on which it makes sense. So what they'll do is they'll take that guy and they'll think to themselves, right, well, it's incredibly hard to be good on a really mechanically intensive champion at the top peak level. And this guy can do it. And some of these other champions aren't as mechanically as intensive. And so in that sense, aren't as hard, aren't as skillful. So if he's so good on those really hard champions in a skill sense, he should be able to be good or at least decent and pretty good on those other champions. Therefore, all around, he should be the best jungler. And these guys should stand above anyone who doesn't have that mechanical level of skill. Now, the problem with that logic is that the flaw is that you're only judging like skill in terms of mechanical skill or ability to outplay someone in a specific sense that's very mechanically intensive and dependent. The flaw is that people are not recognizing or acknowledging that it is a different skill set to be good as a jungler on champions which aren't mechanically intensive, and to either beat the guy who's mechanically intensive or be one of the best in the world but without a lot of mechanical skill yourself, and on champions which don't allow for it and don't allow for massive amounts of outplay value. So in as much as we understand the mechanical aspects like hand-eye coordination, timing of when to do it, ability to make creative plays in the moment to outplay someone, like sheer amount of hours put into these champions, we can understand these concepts when we're talking about mechanically strong one, but people are blanketing or ignoring that when we're talking about the champion that's less mechanically intensive. I mean, now it's all about decision making. Now it's about a different type of visualization, as opposed to trying to visualize a specific gank and how it could happen in the moment, creatively visualize what you can do. Now we're talking about visualizing where the enemy's going to be on the map and how to just neutralize him instead of sometimes getting a kill, or where you're going to counter gank at, or how you're going to come in to just prevent a gank, all these sorts of things, or trading a gank elsewhere. There's also a level of intuitive understanding that comes. So decision making itself is very hard to learn. I mean, sometimes mad mechanics for certain champs mean you don't have to do a lot of decision making. You go in, you make the play, you make the outplay. It's all based on your skill. You get the kill, you secure it for your team. Now you didn't have to do, or maybe so much creative decision making. Now, obviously, there's a bit of both to either aspect, and some of the best junglers are going to have some of both. But in this sense, that sort of decision making on the less intensive champion is at more of a premium and might be more based around how you work with your team, what time you go to a certain area, how you set up a gank later on. It's not just one that you can go in and create the play on the fly. You have to set it all up and then have the wave in a certain position, have your top laner ready, bait him in, all these sorts of things. And there comes, I've noticed, with the guys who are fantastic, in the same ways we can acknowledge this like innate, incredible ability in the guys who are mechanically very strong, where someone like a Bengi could practice forever and he probably won't be at that level. Somehow people don't go the other way. They don't acknowledge that actually someone like a Bengi has a certain intuitive understanding of how to play the less intensive champions, which is also quite unique and quite brilliant. And yeah, he's worked on it, but some of those other people, like a Blank, for example, or Peanut, maybe they won't ever have that type of intuitive understanding. They could get pretty good in some area and shore up their weaknesses, but maybe they won't have that. And so I think Peanut at the moment is a great example of this, because he's a jungler for Rox Tigers. I actually do think there have been times when he was a pretty solid candidate for best jungler in the world. Now, it does help that he's on one of the absolute best teams, an amazing top laner, all these factors. It also certainly helps that Rox themselves, their old jungler situation was quite troublesome. I mean, Lee/Hojin, as he then later be called, and they had Wisdom as well as a sub. He wasn't a strong jungler. He had a lot of issues on those mechanical champions. He tried his best to fit within the team, but the problem was they had too many liabilities. Like Kuro in his own way was never a massive liability except for like the first sort of 8 months of Rox Tigers. I mean, back when they were GE Tigers. But he had his own aspects where he was going to get outshone by a faker, by some really strong player, and demanded a lot of help. So one of the things about having Lee/Hojin as well was he was another liability they had, and that was just a little bit too much. That's why you couldn't really win a Worlds. That's why they kept, one of the reasons why they kept failing in those finals. Now, you bring in Peanut, you've shored up one of those weaknesses, you give himself a strength elsewhere, and he can even cater, obviously, to Kuro, and we've seen Rocks have become even more dangerous as a result. So Peanut, when everything fits him, looks like the best jungler in the world. I mean, he takes over games single-handedly, wins games outright. He wrecks the opposing jungler, just fucks up his jungle, gets in his face, kills him. It just makes it so difficult for the so oppressive a style of play. He gets tons of ganks off where he needs to. He, as a result of being so dangerous on these champions, he demands specific bans, target bans to him within the jungle. Otherwise, you know what level of danger and threat you're giving him on a certain champion. And yet, in a sense, he is a bit overrated. Not massively, but and he has, to give us credit, this year started to improve on some of those other champions more. But he is someone where it was specifically his danger was these super mechanical intensive champions or the aggressive playmaking champions. He wasn't as sick when you put him onto those other champions, the more decision-making ones, the one that was player on the team, the ones that aren't just about getting mad ganks off all over the place and outplaying the opponent to get back into a game or get ahead in a game. I mean, we've seen some good other examples of this in the West, players who, in their primes, get overrated in a certain sense. So, for example, an obvious one to me is Amazing. The old Copenhagen Wolves, TSM, Origin, this jungler, because he's had certain times. Now, funnily enough, in the latter day, he's become more a guy who plays like a Gragas type champion. But back in the day, yeah, he used to only be this Lee Sin, play some Kha'Zix, some Elites. These sorts of champions were the sort that were his wheelhouse. And when he had him, I mean, famously in TSM this happened, they won the game most of the time. He could take over the game with plays. He could create plays. He knew what to do at all times and was comfortable. But when he didn't have these champions, I'm not talking just about the volleyball game, he did lose most of the games. There was a lot of problems he had. He couldn't play around the team as well. He couldn't get himself back into games as well. He didn't look as comfortable. He didn't always seem to have the same decision-making, intuitive understanding of the game that some of the players who played those champions did. Like, ironically, the odd one who he'd replaced on those sorts of champions was obviously always dynamite and always knew how to work with the mid laner. Another good example, a really extreme one in my opinion, is actually Shook. Because Shook, when you put him on certain champions, was a monster. And even they didn't even have to be necessarily purely mechanically advanced, but it just had to be certain playmaking ones. Like he had some, I mean, obviously good ones like Rammus, where the notion was if he could somehow get ahead early on with his playmaking, then he could snowball the game even on something like that. So it was quite unique, but it was so extreme. And you saw that when he forced him onto other champions and when you put him into Season 5, yeah, he had his issues actually. He wasn't effective. And he's the guy who really didn't know what to do when he wasn't in his comfort zone or if he was behind. He had real problems understanding what to do in decision-making wise. And then his intuitive sense, which was fantastic when he was on a Lee Sin, just evaporated. It was just gone at that point in time. And he actually could become a liability to the team where he could have carried the team in certain other games on the champions and in the right meta. And I actually think even Jankos has to be counted in this sense. Not because he can only play mechanically intensive junglers. I mean, those are obviously his best. But because he's a player where you look at his strengths and you think this guy should be the best jungler in the West by far. In fact, fuck it. This guy should be maybe even one of the best in the whole world. Maybe the best player in the world as a jungler. Now, that best jungler in the world, as in not just best player overall. Now, the reason why I say that is because this guy's ability within the first 10 minutes to make plays and get ahead and get champions rolling is unbelievable. I mean, this is up there with the best Koreans we've ever seen. And yet, he is one of the factors where you get him past 15 minutes. And either the opponent survives and doesn't get all the ganks off or they don't succeed, he doesn't get ahead of the enemy jungler, and then he runs into a lot of question marks like the whole H2K team does, or if he's behind due to bad plays there or forced onto some of the champions he didn't like in the past, then he would have his issues there and he'd be like, where's the guy who was the best jungler? Where's that guy gone? So there's a reason why guys like Bengi are never dead forever, why they always come back and why they always have their time when it makes sense and the right champion to play on and have a good game on. And there's also a reason, by the way, why guys like Dandy and Kakao do still retain that status above the names I've mentioned so far. Because these guys, they had all the mechanical skills and they had the playmaking skills and they had all the aggression that you want from the super mechanical jungler, and they had it all in the other respect as well. They could play the other champions. They had the complete champion pool, the complete skill set. They could have the great decision making to go along with it, the fantastic intuitive understanding. That's why those guys really are above and beyond everyone else, and they are the gods in some sense. And you can go watch Dandy now, and he's still very good when he's on Vici Gaming. It's just his team isn't that great anymore. Now, one of the reasons I also wanted to make this video is because this extreme swapping between what style works and what meta works and what champions are available and what the team needs is meaning that people, evaluate junglers in way too definitive and harsh a sense as they're good or they're bad now, and they don't always take into account those other factors, or they just blame them for not being able to do it all, when, as I've kind of pointed out, so few really good players can do it all as a jungler. Because, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't buy the notion that some of the best junglers in the world just become trash 3 months later or in a different patch, or when their team starts playing a different style because that metagame didn't exist anymore. And you look how much the talent is recycled in terms of the top players, not as in junglers leaving, etc., although a lot have left over the years. But you look at how who the top junglers are is recycled. Like, they come back into being the top one, and then they go out of it, and another guy comes back in. I think in junglers, you look at the different regions, and top 3 in these regions changes so drastically for junglers compared to other players, mid laners, etc., AD carries, that it just seems unreasonable to think that it's just those players in the whole world who are having these problems, as opposed to the game is changing the most. And obviously, the jungle position arguably is the position that is changed the most by the game changing and by the style changing. I mean, Reignover was probably the most effective jungler in the entire West until the lane swap change came in, where you couldn't do lane swaps anymore. And now suddenly he was still very good, but he didn't have the same insane impact anymore.